we're going to just kind of give a brief overview of my background. I'm from the Philadelphia, New Jersey area, came down to Washington, D.C. for school at Catholic University. Like most people down here, I've received a bachelor's degree in political science, went to Johns Hopkins, and really kind of what started my commitment and interest and desire to go into public service was really my, quote, federal story is what I call it. I was in high school during 9/11, and that kind of inspired me, that tragic event, to find a way to get involved in national security and to become a professional in the national security environment and come down to D.C. I think many of us have different stories that we could tell that ignite really our desire to go into public service. And I'm sure you have your own version of that story that kind of was the catalyst for why you wanted to apply to federal jobs and federal careers to make a difference. That was kind of my start and why I became interested in doing this. Over the years, and one of the reasons why I founded AskNot was because having been a student in Washington and then having risen through the ranks of the federal government and eventually becoming a GS-15 and reaching the kind of the highest level of the federal career service, I wanted to start AskNot because I noticed that there were a lot of people who were qualified, who were competent, who were passionate and committed, but had so much trouble getting into the federal government. And I established AskNot as a resource for those folks to help give them a leg up, because I can't tell you enough how in the federal government there are just tremendous opportunities not only to make a difference, but to enrich yourself professionally and for you to also make a difference in the lives of many other people, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's overseas. So that's kind of the background in terms of why I was committed and why I wanted to start AskNot. A little bit of background on my federal career. I knew I wanted to do this very early on when I was an undergraduate at Catholic University. I graduated there in 2009. I worked, applied on USAJobs to a position in the Secret Service while an undergraduate. It was a paid position, and kind of worked my way up from the bottom of the GS ladder as a GS2. Today I'm a GS-15, and so that kind of is where my professional career trajectory started in the federal government, was with the Secret Service. I left the federal government for a little bit, worked as a staffer on the Senate side, came back into the federal government, again applying on USAJobs at the Department of Homeland Security, where I worked for the Secretary for 2 years, coordinating briefings for her. And then I went back into the legislative affairs world at the National Nuclear Security Administration, again applying through USAJobs, and I've been doing leg affairs work essentially for the last 5 years until I recently joined the Office of Defense Programs with NNSA, again through USAJobs. So what you'll find is as you kind of become more familiar with USAJobs, you'll get better and better at it as you go along. And hopefully today's session will help you kind of learn some of the tricks and strategies and techniques that I've used and that I try to show people. A quick little primer on the federal government and hiring in the federal government and the career market more broadly. Most people don't understand this or don't know this, but most federal careers are actually located outside of Washington, D.C. There are over 500 federal agencies, federal organizations, and commissions and boards that are hiring on a daily basis on USAJobs. So I kind of look at that as you've got a whole marketplace on USAJobs that is hiring, and those positions are in over 150 countries worldwide. So you're essentially looking at the large lion's share of federal careers and opportunities are not in Washington. So if you're a person who doesn't like being in D.C. and who wants to live in a different community or a different state or overseas, that shouldn't stop you. There are just tons of opportunities all across the board for you to look into. The federal workforce is a very diverse place. In speaking about the federal workforce being diverse, one of the other great things about it is there is a a baby boomer population that is in the government currently, and that's kind of what this chart is depicting. As the baby boomer generation retires, there is going to be a continued need in the federal government to recruit a younger generation of workers who have what I call critical skills. And in the federal government, critical skills are things like project management experience, finance, engineering, having business acumen. Those are things that are critical skills. Language proficiency is another example of that. If you have any of those skills, those are things that the federal government is really interested in bringing people on board so they can use those skills in different federal agencies and different locations. So if you're looking at this chart on the left, you could see in one sense with the baby boomer generation retiring is creating opportunities for a younger generation to come in and to do some really great work. This is a source from the Partnership for Public Service, but as you can see there, in the age ranges of 25 through 29 and really up into 35 and 39, there's a huge opportunity to apply for some really fascinating positions in the federal government. And from there, we're going to go to USAJobs here. So USAJobs background is it's the federal clearinghouse for all official U.S. government positions. There are hundreds of thousands of openings at any one time. There are positions in there that are great for folks that majored in foreign policy, engineering, political science, economics, physics, language, philosophy, communications, you name it. There are just a host of different positions that are really well suited to people that have those backgrounds and other backgrounds, including prior service military. And if you're a current graduate student or undergraduate student, I'll speak about this in a little bit, but you actually get preference over other applicants when you apply, and that's something that's really important to keep in mind.
Great, thanks, Mark. I've been compiling a list of all the questions here. Let me first just add that we are recording this webinar, and so if you had any trouble tuning in or hearing it at the beginning, we will send the link out to everyone who is registered, and we'll also keep it on the GAIN website so you can refer back to it in the future. So we had, as I said, a ton of questions here. I'm going to try and get to as many of them as I could. So I'll go in order that we received them here. The first question is the recent graduate applicable both for undergrad and grad programs?
Absolutely. That applies to a recent grad is anyone that has graduated from a vocational school, a technical school, a 4-year university, 2-year university, PhD, JD, whatever. It applies as long as you're in that 2-year window of time.
Great. The next question is, this is for employees in the legislative branch. Is it true that for the purposes of USAJobs, you're not considered a federal employee?
So I'm assuming what they mean is, if you're working on the Hill in the House or the Senate, are you considered a federal employee? You're considered a federal employee, but in terms of applying for jobs in the executive branch, this is not a cut and dry answer. It depends. You'll likely get credible service towards the years that you served in the legislative branch for certain things, but I don't believe that you're not going to be considered a preference candidate to apply for jobs that are only open to federal employees. So even though when I worked in the Senate, for instance, for a number of years, I couldn't apply to jobs in the executive branch with preference because I was not a executive branch employee. When you work in the federal government for 3 years or more, generally you get what's called tenure, or you get permanent status, meaning you can apply to other jobs as a preference candidate and kind of get a leg up on other people. Coming from the legislative branch, that does not happen.
Okay. The next one here is there a place to be trained on how to create job-specific resumes for USAJobs? I think that's actually a good segue to what you do at AskNot, and then we'll get back to some of the other questions.
Okay.
So I guess the answer I would say is there a place on how to be trained on how to create job-specific resumes for USAJobs other than this webinar and future webinars in this series? That's what you guys do at AskNot.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we do is we work one-on-one with folks, students and professionals, people who are looking to transition their career into another direction. My team here works with people one-on-one to do that. Actually, we spend a lot of our time doing that, helping people understand the process. And our method and doctrine at AskNot is we don't want people to have to come to us continually. We like to teach people how to do it and teach people how to maneuver and navigate the system so they can feel empowered to do that on their own. But yes, we do work with people one-on-one where we educate them. We work with universities. We work with different nonprofits and organizations to help educate them about the process and make them a competitive candidate in the selection process. So yes.
Great. I have a good question here for you. So you've applied for a job on USAJobs and your application status has been listed as referred. It's been like that for about 2 to 3 months. You haven't heard back from them. Is it fair to say that you're not getting an interview?
Not necessarily. So that's a really great question. If you're referred, that's excellent. That's a really good sign. That means the person that is going to make the decision on whether or not to hire and interview you has your resume. You want to get referred as many times as possible when you're applying. Now, in the federal government, one of the challenges is there are a lot of people that apply to federal jobs. So sometimes it takes the hiring manager a long time to go through that because they have different requirements that they have to meet. They have different lists of candidates that they have to go through, and they have to kind of check those boxes. I would say don't give up hope, but don't stop applying. Continue applying. Don't take your foot off the gas pedal, and think about ways that you could reach out to the hiring manager or someone on LinkedIn. This is where networking becomes a really key factor because you may know someone that knows the hiring manager, and you could say, hey, I applied to this position. I'm wondering if you could help tell me what the status of the hiring action is. So don't give up hope. Try to find ways to connect with the agency so you can make sure that your name is flagged and you can get updated on where the position is.
We have someone who, they're an experienced professional. They've had 2 distinct professions, done a number of part-time, short-time, interim jobs, contract jobs, back and forth between fields, and had multiple jobs at one time. And I guess their question is, how do you put that patchwork of jobs kind of into the system when that wants you to have these absolute start and end dates? Is there a way to do that?
So the way that I would do that is and that's again is not a cut and dry answer on this one, but one of the things that you'll want to do is make sure that you appropriately and accurately capture all of your professional experience in your USAJobs resume. As I said, all experience is good experience, and you want to make sure that it's captured in there so that when you apply, they can see that the HR professional that's essentially grading the resume can see that, oh, this candidate has met X, Y, and Z criteria. So err on the side of caution to put additional information in the resume. I'd say there's no cutoff date per se. You have to make a strategic judgment call, and we here at AskNot would work with you on how do you balance that. If you have 20 years of professional experience or 10 years of professional experience, when do you want to cut that off? And that's really a strategic decision, and one of our coaches and advisors would work with that person to help them understand from a strategic standpoint what would be the best option for them to pursue.
We have a question here about transcripts, and they're asking, what about transcripts from 1984 and 1988? And I'm wondering why these specific dates. So perhaps, transcripts from back then were just more difficult to obtain or more difficult to include in the system. Is that something you're familiar with? Have you heard of it from?
What I'm thinking the person might be asking about is, so, if you've graduated recently, you get your transcripts electronically in most cases. For transcripts that might be a bit older, what you may want to do is just get the hard copies of them sent to you and upload them as a file to USAJobs, scan them, upload them, and put them in the system.
Okay. So the next question is it okay for your resume to be longer than 1 page since they're looking for such specific info?
Absolutely. Unlike careers in the private sector, USAJobs and federal careers do not hold people to that 1 page, that general 1 page requirement. In fact, if you go along with the suggestions that I've provided on the course of this webinar, it would lead you to have more than 1 page, because you're going to want to be looking back into your history to see how can I match the criteria of the announcement with my experience, and that often requires us to look back. So absolutely, if you need to have 2 pages, 3 pages, 4 pages, and I've seen even more than that, then you should do it. You should make sure that it's all captured there.
Yeah, I'll just add that I've never subscribed to that idea that you have to have a 1-page resume. I would say for outside of federal jobs, 4 pages is probably a little much, but I've always tried to keep it to 1 or 2 pages, making sure that you're getting in there the most important information. I get the idea that it shouldn't be 15-page resume, but I just think that the further along you get in your career, if you're just trying to fit everything into 1 page, you're missing out on a lot of stuff. So
that's a good point. But I also want to caution people while you are looking back in your professional experiences, don't add fluff. Anything that's in your resume, whether it's the private sector or the public sector, should have a purpose and should have a strategic purpose to why it's in there. Because you're messaging to the hiring folks what your capabilities and your knowledge is. So anything that's in your resume should have a purpose. It shouldn't just be there as a element to add fluff to your experience.
We have a couple questions about GS9 level jobs. The first is, if you're in the process of getting a master's, should you apply? Do you need to apply at that GS9 level?
If you are getting a master's, I don't think it would hurt to apply to GS9. It also may not hurt to apply to a GS11, and here's why. You may have professional experience that qualifies you for a GS11 job, and you may only have a bachelor's degree. So perhaps what I said earlier was maybe a bit confusing. That's why I said that those are not hard and fast rules. If you have, let's say, 7 years of increasingly more complex professional experience in a particular area, but you only have a bachelor's degree, that does not mean that you should just apply to GS7 jobs. You should be applying to 11, 9, 8, 7. You should be applying to the whole wide scope of different jobs, not just that one little category just because you have a bachelor's degree. So don't narrow the scope. If you have the professional experience that qualifies you for a higher graded position, then you should apply for it. And you have to make the case as to why you are qualified for that position, and you do that through making sure the experience is in your resume.
Okay, and the second question was if applying for a GS9 position, if you have both the skills and a master's degree, which do you reflect in the questionnaire, one or the other, or a combo of both?
The questionnaires are the occupational questionnaire that you're going to get is going to have very specific questions, and it will tell you how it wants you to answer in terms of your education or your experience. They're usually pretty clear with asking you how they want you to view the question. Many times when you go onto a job announcement, it will give you an opportunity to actually look at the occupational questionnaires before you submit the application. I would encourage you to do that because you want to know how you're going to answer those questions before you actually get into the phase of the process where you have to answer the questions. On the job announcement I'm looking at right now, it gave us an opportunity to view them, and I was viewing them, and they were very straightforward. When you answer occupational questions, Again, think outside the box. All of your experience is credible. So don't just narrow yourself down to answering in that one particular way. Think outside the box.
Okay. So we do have quite a few more questions, so I'm going to try and get to a couple of them, and then we'll close out the webinar.
Okay.
First is, how do you tailor your resume if you're applying to multiple jobs when it's associated with your profile rather than the job application?
So if I were, let's say I were applying to a particular career field, and let's say it was, I'm applying to legislative affairs jobs on USAJobs. I'm going to do my very best to make sure that and in USAJobs, you can actually create up to, I think it's 4 or 5 different resumes in USAJobs. And so you can use those resumes to apply for different career fields, so you don't always have to go in and remake your entire resume because you want to apply for a project management job instead of a legislative affairs job. So the system gives you that flexibility. But if we were using Leg Affairs jobs as an example, I would make sure I have a really solid Leg Affairs resume saved in USAJobs. And then when I apply to those positions, I would make sure that the different sections that we talked about were reflected in there. What you'll often find is you won't have to do a wholesale rewrite of your resume because you already have some of the major elements in there. Hopefully that answers the question for that individual.
The next question is, let's say you have additional information that might not be within your job experience. So let's say you are a volunteer for an organization like GAIN, and you've gained, no pun intended, a lot of experience through that, and you want to add that in. Where can you put that additional information within the application process?
That's a great question, and I'm glad people are thinking about the broader picture and volunteer experiences. There is a section, USAJobs, in your profile towards the end where you can insert things like volunteer experience, academic experience, different things that you've done that are outside of the professional world. It could be papers that you've written, articles that you've published. There's a bunch of different opportunities in the profile section that you can upload that information and make sure that the hiring folks have that. And that's great. You should be doing those things.
Here's a good question for you. Is it worth signing up for community college classes to be eligible for pathways, even if you have a BA or a master's?
I'm guessing that person is asking because they want to get potentially preference for a recent graduate or a student position. I mean, that is totally your call on how you'd like to do that. I know, universities and taking additional classes are often expensive. I would say to that person or to any individual that's thinking about it is, why don't you try going in and applying some of the techniques that we spoke about today and trying to learn about them and implement them before going back to school for the deliberate purpose of getting preference on a job. I think there's many easier and less expensive ways to get a job that you love in the federal government than just going back to school. And that's exactly one of the reasons why AskNot exists, is to help people strategically maneuver that process.
Great. So there are several questions that came in late. I'm only going to get to a couple of them here. We have one that I wanted to touch on. We have someone here who's a veteran journalist, and they've always wanted to work at VOA. Do you have any specific advice for that? And I might just say for that case, you should feel free to reach out to AskNot separately and just chat with them about kind of the things that they do and the services they offer, and you can do that at AskNotLLC.com. So maybe we'll hold off that one because it's so specific to you, unless, Mark, you had any thoughts you just wanted to share with the group. If not, we can move on to the next question.
No, I would definitely have them reach out to us so we could help them offline about that one.
Great. So, Mark, your contact info, I think you're just mark at AskNotLLC.com.
That's correct.
But it's all on the website, so feel free to check that out. So I guess one good question here is if they have a doctorate in a completely different field than the one that they're applying to, can you count that?
Absolutely. Absolutely, you should count that without question.
And then we had a question about cover letters. I don't know that you got to that, but is that something that you include in there?
Cover letters are not required when applying to federal jobs. I would focus your time, attention, and details to focusing on the resume. I'm a federal hiring manager. I've been one for quite some time. I don't look at the cover letters because they have no bearing on the candidate's suitability for the position. It's the resume where that comes through.
And then I think we will probably make this the last question here, and that is it's asking you to distinguish between received application and referred, and what follow-up is advised if the received is not moving forward.
Okay, so when you apply, most of the time you will get an email almost immediately, if not immediately, very soon, that confirms that you received or that your application has been received by the agency. If you don't get that email, feel free to reach out to the agency to confirm that they've received it. Also, you can go in and try applying again. It's usually very easy. You just resubmit. But you want to make sure that you get that email to make sure that they have everything that they need. And you should always do that and look for that. The difference between resume or application received and referred it's very, very different. Received just indicates that the agency is in receipt of your credentials and your application package. Referred actually means an HR professional has looked at your resume and said, okay, this person is qualified and their resume should be given to the person who's looking to hire for this position. So you want to be in that category of people, of referred. That means that your application and your resume is now with the hiring official, and all they need to do now is have you called and set up an interview for you to come in and talk to them.
Great. So I think we will probably end it at that. I'll just say again, this webinar will be available on the GAIN website, gaindc.org. We're going to send out a link once we have this all set up to everyone who registered here, so you guys can tune in and hear it from the beginning. Again, thank you all for your patience with some of the technical difficulties we had at the beginning. Please stay tuned for more events in this series with AskNot. I think we learned once again that this is a hot topic, USAJobs, and just the federal job market in general. And so there's a lot of different ideas that we have on events going forward in this series, including in-person panel discussions. So once again, check out AskNotLLC.com and reach out to them with any questions that you might have. And thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great day.